Yeah, so forms, right, is a set of widgets, right, that render on the screen that allow users to interact with the application, right? And there are all sorts of widgets, right, where you can enter just a simple line of text, either a long form text or a drop down. You can click on buttons, select from checkboxes or radio buttons, sliders, blah blah blah, or date pickers, right? So let's go through a few of them, right? And so that we can get started on making this interactive. Now, we'll introduce how to use forums, but we can't really make them interactive until we get to JavaScript, right? Where we can handle events, right? Where if you click on something, something has to happen. For that, we need a function, but we haven't introduced JavaScript just yet, right? I mean, we have introduced functions in the sense of creating components, right, that calculate content that display on the user interface, but they can't handle events, not yet anyway, right? We'll introduce that a little later. Okay, so let's look at some of the simpler form elements, right? So here we have the input field, right? So that's an input tag. And so input tag are the simplest and most versatile elements for creating input elements, right? By default, right, if you don't say anything, by default they render as single line input fields, right? We can type just plain text. Okay. Now they do provide a type attribute. So these are called attributes. So just like in XML, attribute elements or tags have optional attributes. These are attributes. Okay. That allow you to configure or customize the behavior of that tag. Okay, in this case, type allows you to specify what type of input you want. Right? Here we're specifying that is of type text. Okay, and what we mean by text is that it's a single line of text, right? That you can type, any character, or you can type in there, right? Numerals, text, right? Dates, whatever, right? Emails, but it is the default. So you don't even have to select the type text because it's by default text. But you know, it kind of introduces the fact that there are other types, right? There are date types, there are number types, email types, telephone types. It's all a bunch of them, right? And we'll see them as we go, right? Now, if it is type text, right? You can have another optional attribute is called the placeholder, right? And placeholder, what it does is that it's one way to give the user a hint of what it is that we're expecting you to type, right? So for instance, it's Alice, placeholder Alice, what it does is that it renders this grayed out area, right? And there's grayed out text, kind of giving you an example of what I am expecting you to type here, right? So I give you username, so I might use maybe John Doe or something that is catchy that, it's giving me a hint of what I should type in there, right? And then once I start typing, it goes away, right? But then, so it only shows when it's completely empty, right? And it goes away when I start typing. And finally, title is like a tooltip. It allows you to provide a piece of text that only appears as you hover, on top, and so that is again another indicator or another hint, right, to the user of what it is that we're expecting, right? And yet another huge hint of what it is that we want them to type is the label. The label kind of allows you to put like a title on top of the input field, right? Kind of telling, hey, this is what I want you to type. Type in the field, type the username, right? So let's just take a look at an example of this. So let me just copy some of this real quick for username, right? So let's create here a div where we can play around with forms. So div, and we'll do for forms, form elements. Okay, And so let's take a look at just a simple input like that, just like that, right? And see how that renders. There it is, right? So let's put this here on the left side and like that, so we can see side by side what we're typing here. There we go. Perfect. Yeah, so here we have the input field, and notice that it renders like just a regular text. Right, let's make this bigger. Okay, and yes, I can type anything, text, any characters, any special characters, right? Now I can give a hint by using a placeholder. I can say placeholder. I could say John Doe, G Doe. There it is. So notice that it's kind of like a hint. Notice the cursor is blinking, but the grayed out area is still there. As I start typing and I say Alice, notice it disappears. But when I delete everything, it comes back. Again, give me the example. Or another way that I can tell you what I'm expecting is to put a title, right, and say some very long, verbose tooltip that I'm asking you what to type in there. So please type your username, which should be unique, right? And so this only appears when I hover. So as I hover, notice that it'll appear. So this little text, right? That as I hover away, right, it goes away, right? And also I can be very explicit about this and put a label and say label. Now I could just put username on top of this. I could say username like that, right? And obviously that makes it very obvious what I'm expecting you to type, and that's fine. I mean that works, right? But now, ever since we've um, started creating applications that render on phones, right, or smaller screens, this might render on the phone too small to interact with this, right? So oftentimes because phones are becoming more and more the main interaction with users, right? A lot of care should go into implementing user interfaces, right, with our main demographics, right, of mostly who's going to be looking at this, somebody with a phone, right? So, so on the screen, right? For instance, one of the challenges with a small screen is that if something's too small, it makes it really hard to peck at it with your finger, right? So for instance, if I want to click on this, certainly I can with my finger can click on the text area. But one nice thing that I would like to be able to do is to increase the clickable area as much as possible, right? And so one common thing that we want to do, for instance, what we can do is that if I mistakenly click on the label, it would be nice for it to kind of hint, it says, oh, you meant to click on the text area, right? So so we can actually turn that behavior on as follows, right? What we can do is um, uh, wrap this with a label, right? Wrap this with a label like that, right? Notice that I save it and it doesn't visually change anything. It still looks just like the text that it is, right? As nothing has changed, but now I can now uh, tie these two elements together. I can tie them together. I can relate them by as follows. I can give this a unique identifier. I can give it a sense. Okay, well, this is my username, like that, right? Right. So by ID is an attribute that allows me to uniquely identify each element on the screen. And by definition, this should only occur once on the screen, right? And so now that I have uniquely identified, I can now reference it, right, from my label so that they are now related to one another. I can say that this label is for the username. Okay. Now they are related. One of the behaviors that we get from that relationship is that if I click on the username, notice that the text area has focus. See that? And so now us on such a large screen is not a big deal. But on a phone that you have such a small screen, that it is a huge deal, right? That you make this, you make it so much easier to just click somewhere in the vicinity, right? And it's focused. All right. So definitely a requirement, good practice, best practice. You should definitely implement it. Okay. All right. So a couple more. Say I do password, right? So this one is maybe there's a password, and this is password two. And this is password. I can't type password. Maybe so. Please type your password. Your password. Which doesn't have to be unique, right? All right. Okay. So one of the things here is that notice that the fields, the text, right, plus the input field seems to flow from left to right. You see that? And then when it reaches the end of the screen, notice that it starts wrapping, right? And when it reaches and it doesn't fit, it wraps. See that? So we call that inline layout, right? It's laying out the content inline, right? One after another, one in line with the other, right? And this is the default behavior, right? That things just flow from left to right until there's no more space and just wraps, right? Now, not everything renders like that. For instance, these guys, right, don't render like that. Notice that they are broken into individual, lines, right? And same thing with the headings, right? Same thing with the paragraphs, right? Paragraphs, uh, literally add vertical spacing in between the paragraphs. So we call that behavior of adding the vertical spacing, we call that block layout, right? These elements, we call them that they are block elements. Right? So headings, paragraphs, lists, right? All those are block elements because they add the vertical spacing, the new line. Divs, right? They add vertical spacing. But other elements that don't add the vertical spacing, that just flow from left to right, we call that inline, right? And together, right, between inline and block elements, you can pretty much do all sorts of complex layouts, okay? Now, but this looks funny, right? That password is kind of on the same line. So typically we would want to add vertical spacing. So we could do it several ways, right? We can wrap this whole thing in a paragraph. We could put this in a div. We could do that, right? Or a simple way is to just add a break, right? So a break is a tag that adds a vertical spacing in between, right? And there it is. So there we go. We have this broken up, right? So that they're broken up into new lines. Yes? Right, so break. So what else here? So notice this password, it's giving a hint. Typically password, you shouldn't be able to see the password, right? So just like this one, the default here is text, right? The type here is text. That's the default. So where it allows you to type just plain text. This one is of a different type, right? We don't want to see the text, right? So the correct type here would be type password, which hides the text so that anybody who's prying eyes won't be able to see, right? And it hides it so that you don't see it, right? So and the placeholder, right? Perhaps you can give it, that we truly want something, a good password, so we can give an example that please provide a strong password. Okay. So yeah, so we other elements are buttons, right? That are meant for clicking on something or interacting, and they're implemented using the button tag, of which there are different types of buttons, right? The default type of button is submit, which is unfortunate because it's a legacy behavior that we don't use anymore. Submitting a form, right, to a server used to, have a particular strategy that we don't use anymore, right? Well, I mean, we still can use it, but we prefer to use JavaScript to do the submission for us, validate the form, right? Intercept that behavior, take over that behavior, right? And don't let the default behavior of the browser to submit the form. We want the JavaScript to handle that. So when using button, right, make sure to use type button so that the form doesn't get actually submitted out to the server, right? So these render like this. So we can say, let's create here some buttons at the bottom, right? And that renders like that. And we should be able to break them. Right? So we could do BR at the end for each one of these. And also at the end of this input field, there we go, right? Go delete, edit, update. And then, as we progress in the assignments, right, we're going to start looking at on-click that allows us to handle the events, right? So for instance, hello world, pops up an alert. And the way we're going to do that, as we progress and introduce JavaScript, is that onClick allows us to assign a callback function that would be invoked when the button is clicked, right? In this case, it's using an arrow function. It's a lambda function. Anonymous function has no name. Notice it's a function, right, that has no name that could be invoked by name, right? So it's a kind of like a throwaway function. It's only meant to be used to handle the button click. In this case, to pop up an alert. Okay. Now there are other types of buttons, such as radio buttons and checkboxes, right? So let's talk about that a little bit, right? So if you have, so let's create a couple of input fields here. So for instance, for favorite genre, right? So let's see. And let's see how that renders like that. So let's say, like that. So here's our favorite genre. Let's add a couple of input fields. Okay, and this renders like a ready button. There it is, ready button, and we're gonna put comedy there. Comedy. There it is, a comedy. And let's implement a few of these. So we have and let's see, type radio. I'm not going to add the name. I'm not going to add the ID because I want to show you something. So let's add comedy. Let's add here some BRs. And so let's create a few of these. So comedy, drama, right? And sci-fi, like that. And let's add horror. Okay. One thing that you'll notice, right, as we create this, notice what happens. If I click on the radio button, so radio buttons are meant to convey the fact that only one of them should be selected, right? So they're what we say they should be mutually exclusive, right? Whereas checkboxes are meant for multiple choice, right? Where or many choices, right? Where you can select several, all that apply. So radio buttons are meant for single choice, right? So it's a multiple choice of which one choice is the correct one. Whereas checkboxes, which are square, right, are meant for all that apply. Select more than one, one or more. But notice that so type radio definitely it's rendering as circular, but the single selection is not turned on by default. Notice that if I click here and then I click there, it's allowing me to select several. You see that? Which is not what I want. Right? So, to make these aware of each other, right, that they should be mutually exclusive, right? We have to somehow group them together, right? And the way we group them is by giving them the same name. Okay. So by applying here the name attribute, right? Okay, and if they have the same name, then they'll know that they are of the same group and that they should be mutually exclusive from each other. Okay, so in the example, the yeah radio genre, yeah, okay. So let's give them the name radio genre. Okay, and so let's give them the same name to all these, like that, like that, like that. Okay. So now all the checkboxes know that they belong to the same group called radio genre. And now if I click on one, it unselects all the other ones in the same group. Now I can have multiple groups, right? So for instance, I might have favorite color, say, right? This is favorite color, right? Where this is red, yellow, blue, and green, right? Okay. Notice that because I forgot to change the name and they all are part of the same group, they're all mutually exclusive, right? So notice if I click red, it unselects horror, which makes no sense, right? These should be part of two separate groups that don't interact with one another, have nothing to do with one another. That's why the name should be different. So this should be radio color or something. Now, the fact that I'm using radio here makes no difference, right? Not this doesn't make this a radio. It's just that I chose the name radio. Okay, so it doesn't have to be called radio at all. So I'm going to remove it just so that I don't confuse you here. I just chose the name radio, right? Just to know that this was a radio example. So there it is. So now they all belong to the same group, color group. So now they're mutually exclusive amongst each other, but they don't affect the other group, right? So you can create multiple groups, multiple questions. Are you married? Are you tenured? Are you a citizen? Blah blah blah. Each one with yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, right? And they're all independent questions. They don't interact with one another, right? So yeah, so that's radio. The other thing is that we did earlier, right? That you select the label that the input field gets the focus. We want something similar here for the radio buttons because I mean here on the screen, on a large screen, it's not such a big deal, right? I can just click on this. It's not very challenging, but on a phone, right, on a really small screen, it makes it really challenging, right, to peck, right, and get it, very, very precise at the radio button, right? So ideally, I would want to be able to click on the label, right, so that it also focuses on the radio button. So to do that, we can do the same thing we did earlier, right? We can give these unique identifiers, we say, ID, and call this comedy, oops, comedy, like that, right? And then I can put this in a label. So I can say label, and I can say for, so HTML4, right? And say comedy, like that. See that? And so now I can click on the label, right? And then it selects the radio button. That's a best practice. Definitely, you should always use it. Increase the size of the clickable area to make it easier, right? And provide a better experience for our clients, our customers. Now we can do that. We can use an ID and an HTML4, or we could do it another way, right? Is to just wrap the whole thing right? And one big label like that. See that? That does the same thing, right? It associates the input field with the label, right? So that you can just click anywhere here, and then it focuses on that radio button. Okay. Right. Uh, yeah. So work on those exercises. Again, this is meant for you to practice on your own, right, and gain some skills. Grow your self confidence, right? That you should be able to feel that you can implement any user interface using HTML and CSS. Okay. There's some drop downs, right, on doing select, and then options where you can also use for selecting individual items or multiple, right, by using select many, right, by using the multiple attribute where it allows you to select several. Again, go through the exercises for multiple choices, radio buttons, checkboxes, so drop downs, right? Uh, um, Date pickers, right? So go through each one um, and just practice so that we can go into more challenging things.